thank you to everyone who has joined us today. Obviously, this is a very popular topic and one that is very close to my heart because we have a home as well that is a second home, and the planning around it is something that I think is really critical for people to think about. And oftentimes we don't think about how to pass on these types of what we call heirloom properties. So bear with me while I get this going. Oftentimes when we have a family home, whether it be a home down on the Cape, a home, maybe up in New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, or even our primary home that has kind of become the center of our family activities. We often buy these homes, or live with these homes with the desire to really have them as the center of that activity and to be able to make great memories. That's one of the things that I hear people talk about when they're talking about their homes and how to handle the second homes in particular. But they can also come with incredible pitfalls that we have to be very aware of. So one of the first things that I always talk with clients about is if you're still in the decision-making phase about, whether to buy a second home or whether to keep a second home, there's lots of things that you always want to think about. We buy these homes again because we want them to be a place where our family gathers, family and friends, and we want them to be able to enjoy it. But we also have to be very careful with respect to these homes that they don't become a financial burden to us, making sure that we can manage the homes, not only from a standpoint of whether there be some kind of a second mortgage or that kind of thing on them, but also, all of the costs that come with running a second home. One of the things that we found very interesting in this new age of technology is owning a second home and kind of keeping eyes on that home is much easier these days, particularly with all of the different gadgets, security systems that you can have, cameras on the home, being able to see who's at the door through the Ring camera doorbell, being able to monitor things like heat in the home and activity in the home. So being able to monitor the homes has become much easier, but you still want to make sure that financially it is something that you can afford to do. You also want to think about whether this second home is going to be something that is just used for you and your family and friends, or are you going to be renting out this family home, and what does that involve? So when you're considering the purchase of a second home, there are many things that you need to consider and make sure that you've kind of gone through the pros and cons of having a second home. One of the things that I hear that sometimes often people forget about is that, when you have a vacation home somewhere, it actually then can preclude or curtail other travel that you might do. And so owning a second home, you may feel like we need to spend time at that home as opposed to going some other place that you may want to travel to and enjoy. So really sit down if you haven't actually purchased that second home yet and you're deciding whether you want to, or whether you're deciding whether you want to keep a second home, sit down and really make a list of the pros and cons of ownership of a home and whether it's something you really want to get involved with. But again, owning a second home can be an incredibly enjoyable experience as well. And what we have found is that it is a place where family does come to, that we're able to have friends, we're able to enjoy gorgeous summer weekends, that kind of thing. But you do want to make sure you think through the cons of it as well. One of the things we talk about with clients too is once they've made the decision to buy a second home, you always want to think about owning the home with the end in mind. Now, I know that sounds a little bit negative, particularly when there can be so many positives about owning a home and creating a space for people to be able to enjoy. But what we find is that the ownership of that home works really well at the first generation. So for instance, I talk about the fact that my husband and I have a second home. It's really great when we're paying all the bills associated with that home. We take care of the property insurance, we take care of all the utilities, et cetera, for the house, and family can come and visit it. But oftentimes when ownership of that property drops down to the next generation, and if at all to the generation afterward, ownership gets much more complicated. And the decision making around how certain things are going to be done, you want to be thinking about all of that ahead of time. So one of the ways that we refer to these properties as heirloom properties, properties that for one reason or another, families want to keep in the family, and they want to be able to continue to pass down that property to the next generation. So we always want to think about what that's going to look like. How does a transfer of ownership look to that next generation? And what are some of the things that we need to think about when we're looking at that? Because on the bad side or the con side, in terms of having these kinds of properties move forward, we need to think about, can the next generation afford it? Are they going to utilize it? What happens if there are needs to make repairs to the property, or there's a need or a desire to make some kind of change or improvement on the property, and how does that get handled? What happens if a child has needs of their own, whether they have creditors possibly as an issue, where they're maybe not good at handling money and they've run up debt? How does we protect it so that this house doesn't become subject to potentially the child's debt, or to things like long-term care costs? And how do we make sure family infighting is minimized as much, or eliminated if we can, but certainly minimized when it comes to maintaining and keeping this property in the family? So first of all, you want to think about, do you have what we call an heirloom property? And again, that can be a very broad definition. It may be a second home that you have somewhere. It may be the vacation home that you go to in another state, or even here in Massachusetts. It may be your primary property, something that you consider to be, again, the center point of the family, and you want to make sure that this property goes forward and is able to be passed on to the next generation. Oftentimes, these homes have a tremendous financial value potentially. Again, there's an old saying that, God's not making any more shoreline, and that's true. And so sometimes these properties can be very valuable financially. And sometimes it's sentimental value. Maybe the property itself isn't worth a lot financially, but sentimentally, it's the place again where your family gathers and where you enjoy. And so it's something that that people want to preserve. And sometimes it's a combination of both, that it has both significant financial value and it also has great sentimental value to everyone. So again, a couple of examples. Maybe your current residence is considered this, your beach house somewhere, a country cottage you have somewhere, lake house, farm, ranch home. All of these different types of examples are things that we often consider to be heirloom property. So a couple of things. Why do you want to save this property? What is the reasoning that people often come in to talk about wanting to save? Or even the next generation talks about, no, we want to make sure that our parents' home is preserved so that we get to use it. People's childhood memories, this is the sentimental part of things, that it has, become a place where family memories are made. People really enjoy gathering at that spot, and they want to make sure that it's maintained. Sometimes family homes have become a source of income. This is a rental property, or a part of the time a rental property in which the family has been able to enjoy some additional income. And so they want to keep that source of income going, and they want to make sure that it remains a reliable source for the family going forward. So there's many, many reasons why people see a home as being something that they want to have preserved and passed on. But in order to make that happen, you really need to make sure that you have a good plan in place about protecting that home. And we talk a lot with, those of you who are clients of ours, about estate planning and making sure that you have your decision-making documents in place and trusts. But when we're talking about heirloom properties, we're really identifying those as being a little bit different, and we want to make sure there's specific language, that there's either a specific type of trust agreement, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about trust in a moment, but a specific type of trust agreement itself in place to hold the property and talk about how it's going to be managed going forward, or that there's some type of language added to a current trust structure that you may have that encompasses the things that I'm going to talk about. And when we're looking at planning, of course, we always look at it comprehensively. We always want to look at things like estate costs, the cost of actually managing this property and taxes that might be associated with it. You know, looking at financial problems that may exist, whether it be for the initial owners of the property. I'll refer to them as the first generation owners, looking at their situation. Potentially, these homes might be exposed to long-term care needs if there's a need for something like nursing home care in the future. And so do we want to protect the property from that type of situation, from lawsuits that may occur, whether it be at the first generation or subsequent generations? We also worry about what we call the killer Ds, deaths of individuals, divorces that may occur, and disability and disputes. So we always, when we're looking at planning, we need to take these things into consideration because, again, there's oftentimes a large financial value as well as the sentimental value that goes with owning these types of properties. So protection just doesn't happen. We have to really lay out a plan as to what's the intent of passing on this property to another generation and how it's going to continue to be protected. So without special planning in place, there are certain things that can absolutely happen. Family homes oftentimes are just left. They're just, you know, I'm going to leave this equally to my children, let's say. But unlike cash holdings, it's not easy, of course, to break up the value of a family home. In order to break it up, it has to be liquidated. And so how do we avoid liquidating the property in order to make sure that we're passing on value? And so it has to be looked at very different. It's not something that we can easily just divide among beneficiaries. So there's a couple of different ways that people look to do this. And one of the things I first talk about with clients is this really something that you want to do? And is this something that your beneficiaries want to inherit? So you need to look at your own family situation to see what the makeup is of them. So for instance, when I talk about my own family, I have 3 children. The desire is to provide for all 3 children equally. But when it comes to a family home, this vacation home that we own, I have 2 children who live out of state, pretty far away. One of the things that I need to consider when I'm deciding whether to go ahead and leave this home to all 3 children is what's their ability to use the property, let's say. You know, the worst thing that we want to do is end up setting up our beneficiaries, our children, to have some kind of infighting among them. I leave this very valuable home to all 3 of them, but I have 2 of them who say, I never get to come visit it. I never get to use it, and yet I have expenses associated with it. So want to first take a look at what your family situation looks like, and leaving this home to the next generation. Is that really something that is reasonable to do? Is that something that is going to really benefit the next generation, keeping it as the family home as opposed to possibly liquidating it? And we'll talk about how some decision making can be done around that. But remember, when you're going ahead and leaving it to the next generation, you're leaving it oftentimes to multiple users. So you're going to have co-users in all of this. You're going to have co-management of it. So instead of just you making the decisions about what happens with the property, they're now going to be making the decisions about it. And how do they come up with the decision-making kind of metrics for that? Who gets to use it over 4th of July weekend, maybe a popular weekend for people, or Memorial Day or Labor Day, those kind of high peak use timeframes. How does the decision get made as to who gets to use it and when? And what are the rules or the parameters around the use of it? Also, we have to think about, what if one of the original members of that next generation passes away? Do their beneficiaries then step forward? And now you've even increased the number of owners of this property as we go down the line. So really need to think about these different aspects of it and make sure that you have a plan in place. And I'm going to talk about the specifics of how that plan gets structured. So remember, second homes become heirloom properties because of their extraordinary either value or sentimental value to the family, but they take a lot of management to make sure that it works. How are you going to handle who's going to use it when, who's going to be responsible for things like maintenance and repair, just being able to cover the basic costs of the property. What happens if there's the water heater goes? What happens if the roof needs to be replaced? How are you going to rent it out? All of these different things we want to approach in a plan about how to pass on the property. So one of the solutions that we use is a thing called an heirloom ownership trust. And again, this can be accomplished in two ways. One is to have an individual trust that just owns the property and just manages this one asset. And another way is to include language in a current trust structure that you may have. And I'm not going to go too deep into some of the different types of trust because it really is going to be very dependent on what your situation is. For instance, are we worried about something like long-term care needs for you? And thus we need to put some kind of a protection trust in place that may have this language in it. Or are we looking to really retain control and ownership of the property with you throughout your life, but then only make it that upon your death that this type of language goes into play? But a trust is really an agreement that happens between the person who creates the trust, the trustee or trustees that they appoint to manage the trust, and the beneficiaries who are ultimately going to benefit from the trust. These can all be, of course, family members. You can choose family members to be the trustees, to be the ones who are controlling things, or you can choose third parties to manage that for you, depending again on your family makeup and what your goals are. And then typically, again, the beneficiaries are family members of yours who you want to make sure benefit from this type of trust. But one of the really big things that this type of trust outlines is what we call August terms. So within the trust, we look to address certain things. How is ownership going to be handled? So for instance, is it, if you have 3 children, a third, a third, a third? Is each of them having a third ownership in that property? How how are you going to go about passing on a child's benefit or ownership of the property after that child dies? You can control that in the trust, determine who can step up and take over their share. We want to always understand the purpose of the trust. Typically, the purpose is to make sure that there's clarity around the management of the property. Who's going to be responsible for what? How things are going to be paid for? Who's going to get to make decisions? Very interesting thing, we have neighbors next to us in our property up in New Hampshire who actually, without this, years ago, mom and dad had built what now is a beautiful home on a lake, and they had 6 children. And all 6 children inherited this property. And it's amazing to me, they on their own had put together this type of structure for the property, and made decisions that, for instance, only the child, not their spouse, has a voting right in terms of how decisions are made for the property. Do you want to make so other people have voting rights as well? So have to think about it. And these 6 children have figured out how to manage this property by kind of following these principles. So understanding how ownership is going to be handled, understanding the purpose of the trust. What are you trying to have happen here with respect to how the property gets managed in the future? How is governance going to work? Again, who gets to have a voting right in terms of a decision about something? And for this particular family, again, it's only the children, the principal beneficiaries under the trust who were the children of the original owners who get an ownership interest and get a vote in terms of governance decisions. But in some families, they may or may not want to have something like a spouse or someone else who is a cousin or an aunt or uncle or some other individual be part of that governance structure as well. How are you going to make decisions about the use of the property? So how do you make decisions about who gets to use the property when? Do you go by some kind of a lottery system? Do you assign weeks? How do you determine who's going to be able to use the property and when? Things like how many guests they may be able to have at the property. Do you limit that so that you're not ending up in a situation? A lot of these lake homes, even a lot of the beachfront properties, have septics, let's say, or issues around how the septic system is managed. If you've got somebody who ends up having 50 people up at the house, not only is there wear and tear on the house, but there's wear and tear on a septic system that has to be thought about. So you all want to think about all of these different things and lay them out in terms that will outline how management can happen in the future. You want to talk about stewardship for the house. How are bills going to be paid? Will you, as the first generation, be providing financial support as well as passing on the ownership of the property to the next generation? Or are you going to leave that up to the next generation to have to figure out how they're going to set aside monies to take care of maintenance of the property, maybe improvements that need to be made to the property, make sure the roof is working, the heating system's working, that kind of thing. So you want to figure out possibly how you're going to handle the money aspect. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some specifics and some ways that you can do that. But these are things that this type of a trust agreement is going to address. The other thing is you want to think about whether you're going to put transfer restrictions on. That's who can become an owner of the property. Do you want your children, the next generation, to be able to decide if they want out, that they can sell their share to someone else? Can you restrict who they can sell it to? Maybe they need to sell it back to other members of that first generation. Maybe you'll open it up to other family members who might be able to buy. Maybe you say no. If someone's going to sell their share, there's only very clear ways that they can do so, and they're not able just to sell it to anyone. Because again, you're trying to avoid a situation in which you end up with a whole slew of owners who were not initially considered when you were thinking about putting this together, and being able to have some third party who you never wanted to have as part of this trust structure. So thinking about these kinds of issues, making sure that you have clarity as to how you want things to pass is critical. Now, sometimes I have people who say, look, I don't want to have to go through all of this. I handle it while I'm alive. That can be something that the next generation has to deal with. But we still can put some parameters into a trust and say, for instance, I'm going to leave this property to my children, but here's what has to happen. There's 3 options that they have. The first option is that my children have to sell the property. That's it. Nobody actually gets the property. It gets sold, and it's the value of the property that gets split up among the children, the actual dollar value of it. Another way that they can approach it is say, If one child wants to buy out, or two children or whatever want to buy out the others, how can you structure a arrangement around how that buyout could happen? Maybe it's that a fair market value is determined for the property, and then the ones who want to buy out the other must buy them out at a fair market value. Another aspect of it could be the next generation can take it on, but they must come up with an agreement that addresses these issues that I've outlined here in these August terms within 6 months. And as long as they do so, then they can continue to own the property, but they have to make sure they do so with an agreement in place. So let's take a look at how that works. Again, the trust can do a couple of things. It's going to first of all outline what the options are for the next generation. So it can actually outline those August terms that I just talked about, and then you're imposing those terms on the next generations. Or you can say either you sell it, you buy out someone who may not want to continue to have ownership, or you all come up with an agreement about how you're going to handle this property within a specific period of time to allow the property to continue to function within the next generation. But you really want to think about how you want to pass that on. So when we think about whether you're going to put together the August terms or whether you're going to have the next generation do it, oftentimes these August terms are done for a period of years. You say, okay, here's what the agreement's going to look like for the next 5 years. And after a 5-year period, everyone has to sit down and kind of renegotiate what the agreement's gonna look like from that point forward, because things do change. And you may end up with someone who says, initially, I want to go ahead and stay within the property. So let me take a step back. Let me give you an example. So again, I'll use my own family with 3 children. And let's say after the death of both my husband and myself, the 3 children choose to go ahead and continue to run the property. And let's say in our trust, we had said to them, if you're going to make that choice, then you have to come up with an agreement. And they do so. They come up with an agreement within the time frame for a 5-year period of time. But at the end of 5 years, situations have changed, and you now have a child who says, I'm just not getting the use out of this property that I thought I would. I'd rather take my value out of this property and do something else with it. The agreement can actually lay out that if that situation arises, that now the remaining owners have to buy out that child, and you can set up how you want that buyout to look. Again, is it fair market value, or do you give them a little discount? You say, you know what? You can buy out the share maybe for 5% less or 10% less than the fair market value. And that way you're allowing for a change of circumstance where one child who thought they were all in and wanted to enjoy this property now is able to get their value out, allowing the rest of the children to continue to own it and manage it, and to be able to keep that family relationship as intact as possible. Because the worst thing that can happen is you end up with the next generation of owners. One of them wants out and resents the fact that they can't get their value and they can't get out. And the others want to keep it going and resent the fact that that child isn't paying their fair share to be part of the agreement. So you want to make sure that you're not only laying out what the expectations are, but that you also build in flexibility where it needs to be. And that is that people's situations change, that things can happen, that you want to try to build into the agreement to allow for some flexibility if necessary, specifically somebody wanting out of ownership. The other thing we want to think about again is, again, one of the children passes away and they leave children. How does their family benefit from, let's say, what would have been their value in this property, as either becoming owners of the property and being able to become part of the agreement and using the property, or being compensated in some way in order to make sure that they're getting their share of the property out of it. So you want to make sure that you've thought about, what does the buyout structure look like if somebody doesn't want to stay an owner? They don't want to stay part of all of it. How do you set a price? Is it a fair market value? Do you give a discount? And by the way, there's no right or wrongs to any of this. It's dependent on what you think is fair and how you want to be able to help have this happen. There's also ways of helping to fund not only the keeping of the property. So for instance, if you're still able to get a life insurance policy and you choose to utilize the value of a life insurance payout to be able to help fund the property for next generations so that they have monies to be able to pull from. Or there's a structure that's set up, let's say, to rent the property for a period of time in order to be able to provide funds to help support the maintenance and the upkeep of the property. You also can provide for what we call a take it or leave it scenario, which is that, look, either everyone's all in or everyone's all out. And if people can't agree to all be in, then the property must be sold and liquidated, and everyone gets their fair share and ends up being bought out of the property, and it's sold and no longer part of the family kind of ownership. So these agreements, as much as we want clarity in the agreements and we want them to think about many of the different scenarios, we also do want to build in some flexibility if we can, because people's situations will change over time and they may no longer be able to utilize and enjoy the property the way they used to. And you may want to think about how you could help to fund, if that's something you want to do, the maintenance or some more of a long-term kind of funding situation for the property, because not all of the next generation may be able to afford to keep that property going. So just as a little reminder about what is a trust, remember it's like a handshake that you make between yourself as the creator of the trust, the trustee who you name, and the beneficiaries. And so it is a document in which you are asking a trustee to manage things, and that trustee may be yourself while you're alive. That trustee may be a child, one of the beneficiaries, but they are controlling things for the benefit of the next generation, and they're managing that property for their benefit. And the trust can either be what we call a revocable or revocable trust, and that's one usually where you've maintained control during your lifetime, and it's really only upon your death that that control is no longer with you. Or it can be an irrevocable or irrevocable trust. That type of trust, usually you do not have the control over. You are not typically the trustee. And we usually use those types of trusts to try to protect this kind of property from your future needs, like long-term care. The revocable trust will not provide that type of protection, but the irrevocable trust will. So the type of trust that you choose to hold the property is going to be dependent on your situation and what your intent and goals are with the property with respect to yourself. But all of the trusts will include that kind of August language in it in order to talk about how it's going to get passed on to the next generation. I talked a little bit about thinking about whether you want to fund the trust as well. So we often put property into the trust and have it there for many reasons, keep it out of probate and to make sure that it passes on to the next generation the way you want it to. But we oftentimes have to think about funding too, to make sure that there's enough liquid monies to handle taxes, including potentially estate taxes here in Massachusetts, and to think about how you're going to fund that property, if you choose to, for the next generation to make sure that things like maintenance, general maintenance, and potential, upkeep of the property is maintained for the next generation, at least for a period of time. And there are many different ways, again, to do that. Life insurance is certainly one of them because it's fairly easy liquidity, but you can utilize the proceeds from a retirement plan or from other inheritances or excuse me, and other investments that you have to be able to fund that type of a situation. So this is just a quick thing that shows when we have a property and people have trusts in place. Usually the property is initially owned, let's say, by a husband and wife, spouses, or an individual. We transfer it to a revocable trust if the person wants to retain control, if they're not looking to keep that property safe from their long-term care needs, because they have other assets that will help to be able to pay for long-term care needs if they need it. And then we utilize that August language. Either we create the August language within the trust, addressing all those issues that I talk about, or we say, no, we're going to leave that to the next generation to do, but they must come up with that language within a certain period of time in order to ensure that the property is going to be managed by the next generation in a feasible way. And again, we look to how we're going to fund if you actually do want to put monies into some kind of trust or have monies available to help maintain that property. If we use life insurance, then we use an irrevocable life insurance trust to be able to hold that policy and fund the running of the property for future generations. Some things to think about when you're talking about cost consideration, how will one disinterested heir get bought out? And that may not be something that you feel is your worry. You may say, you know what, that's up to the other beneficiaries to figure out how they're going to buy out someone. But it's important to put the structure together as to how that buyout will be structured. Is it a fair market value buyout? Do you give a percentage off? That kind of thing, if somebody wants out of owning. We do want to think about how estate taxes will be affected by this. If you live, of course, here in Massachusetts and you own the property here in Massachusetts, then that property's value is going to be part of your estate for estate taxes when you pass away. And if there is a tax due, we have to think about how that's going to get paid for, because we don't want to have to liquidate the property, sell the property in order to be able to pay the tax that might be due on it. So something that you also want to make sure is part of your overall plan. And when you're setting up for the next generation, you really want to set them up to succeed. You don't want this property to become an albatross that somehow destroys family relationships, causes it so family members become impoverished trying to maintain this property. You want to make sure that you're thinking also about how do we make the plan flexible enough to give somebody an out if they need it. So they're not stuck with a property when they live in California and don't come back here to the Northeast on a regular basis. They're stuck with the cost of maintaining that property in the Northeast, but don't get the use and enjoyment out of it. So we always want to think about how we build in some flexibility as well, because we want this property that has been such a joy, such a benefit to our family, a place where all the memories are made, to be something that continues to have that characteristic around it as it passes down through the generations and doesn't become something that nobody gets to use and enjoy and is just an expense that they're managing and destroys relationships. So really important that we have a plan together that also has some flexibility to it to let people have an out. So that's really an overview of handling a second property. Again, second properties are wonderful to be able to have something that you really get to enjoy and use. Memories can be made there, etc. But you really want to think about what does that look like when you're passing it on to the next generation, and what kinds of steps can you take to make it so that it's a successful handoff. Any questions that people have?
I do have a question about estate taxes. I'm co-owner of a cottage with my brother, but he lives in Maryland. And if we were to sell, or if he were to die and then we were to sell, would we have to pay estate taxes for him here in Massachusetts?
So I'm going to give you the lawyerly answer to that, Duncan, which is it depends. So it's going to depend on a lot of things. Certainly, property here in Massachusetts is subject to Massachusetts law and subject to Massachusetts estate taxes if it actually qualifies for estate taxes, if the size of the person's estate. So right now, and this is a very brief overview of estate taxes, but Massachusetts has an estate tax that is a threshold, meaning that when the value of the estate is more than $1 million, and when we're talking about what's in Massachusetts is more than $1 million, then there is the potential for an estate tax. And so it depends on the person's overall size of their estate, where they're a resident. Are they a resident of Massachusetts or another estate? Do they have a spouse that they are actually, there's some planning that's been put in place to help reduce estate taxes? It very much is dependent on that individual's situation. So I know that doesn't answer your question, but it is one where you really have to analyze it at the time the person passes away. Now, you can sit down with someone ahead of time and kind of go through some what if scenarios to see whether there might be an estate tax that has to be dealt with.
Okay. The second question I have is, how complicated does the handing down aspect of it has to be? Because we have 5 children and my brother has 6 children. So potentially it would be divvied up 11 ways. And we haven't really figured out how to do that yet.
Well, and that's yet a perfect example of how something that goes from 2 owners who are pretty good at being able to come up with decision making and handling all the costs down to 11 owners, how that can quickly happen. So one of the simple ways to look at that is maybe not yourselves coming up with that August language, but instead saying, okay, look, you guys, you're getting this, and you have to make the following decisions within a certain period of time. You either decide you're going to move forward with all of you owning it, and you have to come up with an agreement, new owners, within a period of time in order to make things work, or you must sell it, or people who want to buy it must buy out those who don't want to be part of it within a certain period of time. So you can lay out that instead of having to necessarily come up with all the specifics about how it's going to be governed if you don't want to do that aspect of it.
Can one of them be designated trustee?
They can, and you have to decide, are you going to give that trustee the ability to say, people, you haven't been able to come up with an agreement, I sell. That's my only option. So that you're not making it so that there's some leeway or wishy-washiness. Either they come up with an agreement within that period of time, or it's sold, and that's that.
Okay.
It's kind of a hard line to have to take, but it's oftentimes the only way of being able to preserve the underlying relationships.
Okay. Yeah, because we have the same situation you do. We've got my brother has children that live all over the US, and we have some of our children don't don't really want to get involved with it because
Mhm.
their spouse's family have camps and what have you that they've kind of taken over as far as management and what have you. So, that would just be another burden for them. They don't come down to the cottage that much, et cetera, et cetera. So they would want to be bought out. But it seems as though to have one of them be a trustee and sort that all out would be probably the easiest way for my brother and myself, because we've talked about it and we can't agree on how to do it. That's what I was saying before.
Well, it's definitely something that you both want to direct if you can. And what I'm hearing from you is that you're already hearing from some of the potential beneficiaries that they don't want to take this on. So that already gives you a starting point that all 11 kids don't want to receive this as part of their inheritance. So there are ways that you can think about structuring that, even if it's just for your own children.
Mhm.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leo. What is your opinion to leave the property to a single heir to keep from multiple owner quarreling issues?
Well, the benefit of just leaving it to one person is that you're just leaving it to that individual who now will become the owner and can make decisions about what they want to do. The issue, though, is whether you want to somehow compensate. So let me use the example of 3 kids. I decide, you know what, I'm only going to leave this property to one of my children. That's great. I've now made it so that no other owners will have anything to be able to say about it. But do I want to? Am I worried about how I compensate my other children? Because this may be a very valuable asset that I've just earmarked for one. And am I concerned about how I'm going to equalize things off for the others? Now, remember, you don't have to equalize things off if you choose not to. But if that is a concern for you, then just leaving it to one person and saying, well, I'm going to let them figure out how they're going to take care of their siblings almost never works. You really want to be very clear. If you're leaving something to one and your desire is to make sure everyone is treated equally, then you've got to re-swizzle how you're handling other assets to be left to the others. Does that make sense? So you're then equalizing off among everybody. But again, you can do as you choose to do with your assets. Oftentimes our second homes are very valuable assets. And so leaving it to one certainly will take away the family dispute issue around who gets to manage and own it, but it's going to cause other issues if you haven't figured out how to equalize off your other beneficiaries. Read that. What's the benefit or purpose of setting up heirloom ownership trust versus adding language about property ownership in an existing revocable or pass-through trust? The biggest difference is certainly if you already have a trust in place and the structure's there, adding language is done through an amendment, but that property is not in any ways removed from your overall estate. If your intent is actually to put that property in what I like to think of it as a locked box, like an irrevocable trust situation, adding language to your existing revocable trust doesn't really help. You're not keeping that property away from the rest of your assets. And again, it depends on your individual situation as to whether that's what you want to do or not. When it's in your revocable trust, you're retaining control, you're retaining the use, and you're able to manage that yourself during your lifetime. But tax reasons, exposure, it's still yours. And so if you needed long-term care in the future, or you were sued, or for tax purposes, it's yours. When it's in an irrevocable trust situation, one of the benefits is after a 5-year period of time here in Massachusetts, we've removed it from your asset holdings with respect to exposure for your long-term care costs. And so that's one of the benefits of having it in a separate trust. Or if you rent the property, there's benefits to having it separated out for liability purposes, let's say someone slips and falls, whatever, you may want to run that separately. And that's one of the benefits of having it in a separate type of trust.
Okay, thank you. Do those rules around funding your long-term care vary widely by state? I'm in California.
So it does vary by state. There's a federal oversight, a federal component to it all. The 5-year look back is a consistent one among the states, but how states handle trusts is very different with respect to benefits like Medicaid.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I hope this was helpful. And as always, we love being able to do these things for you all. Bye now.